Okay, we're going to get underway. um, before we continue with the lecture on aggression, I've got a bunch of announcements to make. So you're going to want to make note of these. First off, the final exam, exam 4, is April 20th, which is, what day is that? 2 Tuesdays from now. So basically 12 days from now. Okay, that's April 20th. Note that it is not at 3:30, it's at 2:15, okay? 2:15 to 4:15. Please don't show up at 3:30 because then you're only going to have 45 minutes left to take the exam. So it's at 2:15. We're going to do it online just like the other exams, okay? So I'm not even going to show up in class. So we're going to just do everything online just like the other exams, just to keep everything consistent with everybody. But make sure you are here at 2:15 for that. I don't think I have a Zoom created yet for that exam. I'm going to create one though, as soon as I can. Okay, so that's exam 4. Secondly, I have posted the study guide for exam 4 on Canvas, so you have access to that at any point. So you can download that whenever you want. 3, assignment 3, it should be visible as of right now in Canvas. I'm going to share my screen with you guys online so you guys can see this. Okay, so if you go to the assignment section, and I'm going to do this in student view. All right, so you should see in the assignment section, assignment number 3, okay? That is going to be due 1 week from today. It's going to be due at the beginning of class at 3:30. Let me just briefly go over what it is. All right. So basically for this assignment, you have 2 options. What I want you to do is to be able to think like a social psychologist. So I'm going to have you do that under one of these 2 assignment options. And the first option, what I want you to do is take an event, something that happened to you or something that you witnessed, and I want you to analyze it from the perspective of a social psychologist. So what you're going to do is you're going to describe the situation very briefly in like 1 paragraph or less. And then I want you to analyze the situation like a social psychologist using at least 2 different social psychological concepts or principles or theories or whatever, okay? So as an example that I give, if let's say, for instance, that you witnessed a fight between 2 people at some point, you could describe what you witnessed, and then what you might want to do is describe how that fight was started because of the fundamental attribution error. And you can describe how the fundamental attribution error played into it. So someone attributed someone else's actions or someone's statement to their personality, which led to that fight, for instance. So that's one thing you can do. A second way you might analyze it is through the lens of, let's say, the self. So you could talk about how self-serving cognitions played a role in leading up to that fight as well. Of course, you can use any concepts, principles, psychological ideas that you want, as long as they are social psychological in nature. There's something that we discussed in class. And I want you to keep in mind that you can't just say there was aggression and that counts as a social psychological concept, okay? You have to talk about some sort of theory of aggression or some sort of principle or something along those lines, okay? Same thing, you can't just say there was stereotyping involved and leave it at that. You have to talk about it from a social psychological perspective. So you might want to talk about social identity theory or realistic conflict theory or strategies that maintain stereotyping or something along those lines, okay? I'm looking for about 2 pages double spaced, give or take, total. You're going to turn this in over Canvas, just like the other assignments. So that's option A. If you'd rather, you could take option B. Option B is to analyze a movie or TV show from the perspective of a social psychologist. So you're basically going to do the same thing, except instead of talking about some event that happened to you, you're going to talk about whatever happened in the movie. And as an example here, I give an example of the movie Do the Right Thing. It's a late 80s movie, but in that movie, they talk a lot about prejudice. You could talk about some theories of prejudice that play into that movie. At the end of the movie, there's a big riot that happens. So you could talk about de-individuation and how that can lead to rioting behavior and that sort of thing, okay? Again, same thing as with the first option. Don't just say there was aggression, there was stereotyping, there was helping, something like that, okay? That's not a social psychological analysis. Make sure you go into depth about some sort of theoretical perspective or some sort of, talk about some sort of social psychological phenomenon. Okay, so that's assignment 3. Again, that's due 1 week from today at 3:30. And you're going to turn that in over Canvas just like the other 2 assignments. So you should be able to see that right now in Canvas. That should be visible too. Okay, I'm not done yet. A couple more announcements. I assume you know that the last day to participate in extra credit via SONA is going to be next week. Next week is the last week of classes before finals week. So you've got until next Friday to participate in SONA studies if you want to get your extra credit that way. As an alternative, if you want to get extra credit but you don't want to do SONA studies, there's an alternative way to do extra credit as well. That's also posted in the assignment section. You can see that on Canvas under alternative extra credit. Okay, that is going to be due on the day of the exam. That's April 20th. Remember that for each one of these papers that you turn in, you can earn up to 3 points of extra credit, up to a maximum of 8 points. If you've gotten all your 8 points via SONA studies, then there's no point in doing this alternative extra credit, okay? This will not get you any more extra credit. This is only if you don't, or if you didn't get all your points via SONA studies. But you can see what the assignment actually is for that. Okay, so you can turn in up to 3 of these alternative extra credit papers if you haven't done SONA studies. I'm not sure what you mean in chat when you say what chapter is this, option A. You can talk about anything that we've discussed in the semester in social psychology. One last thing I will mention as well is that if you go, there's also an additional extra credit opportunity. So if you think about it, the SONA studies and the alternative extra credit, you can use any combination of those to get up to 8 points of extra credit. However, I've got a couple of additional extra credit opportunities that will get you even more extra credit, extra credit, basically. One of those is posted right now. If you go to the module section and you scroll to this, you should see extra credit opportunity number 1, okay? Even if you've got all your extra credit via SONA or whatever, this will still get you 2 additional points of extra credit. You have, I think that's available now as well. You have until Thursday, 1 week from today at 3:30 to complete this. It's a very simple and very quick sort of task that you have to do. It should take you like 5 minutes or less, but there's like a link to an external website, as you'll see. It's really, really quick. I recommend that everybody in the class do this extra credit, and I'll give you a free 2 points if you do it. I mentioned last class, there will be an additional extra credit opportunity. I'm going to wait until Tuesday to mention that because I'm overwhelming you with sort of information already right now, but there will be an additional extra credit opportunity I will give you on Tuesday as well. So for now, for next week, just remember, do the assignment, which is due Thursday, do the additional extra credit opportunity, which is worth 2 points and which you have to do by Tuesday as well. Okay. That is correct. Extra credit opportunity 2 is not up yet. That is correct. That will be up on Tuesday, but I didn't want to overwhelm people with everything yet. So on Tuesday, you'll have that additional extra credit opportunity. But for now, you have this first opportunity. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay, I think that covers everything. Everyone's clear on what is expected of them? Okay, if that is the case, then let's continue with talking about aggression. Alternative extra credit is just for the student. So alternative extra credit is for people who did not get all their points via SONA. So if you've got 8 points, and remember that I double whatever you get in SONA. So if you get 4 points, I double that to 8 points in the class. You've maxed out. If that's the case, there's absolutely no need to do the alternative extra credit. It won't earn you anything additional, okay? If you've gotten fewer than 8 points of extra credit via SONA, then you can do that alternative extra credit, and every paper you turn in for that will be worth 3 points. But of course, the additional extra credit opportunity is different from the alternative. The additional extra credit, everybody can get 2 points for that. Okay. So last class, we had ended up talking about some theories of aggression. We had talked about some biological theories of aggression, in particular the evolutionary theory and how that explains how we could have evolved this tendency to aggress. We also talked briefly about the idea of cultures of honor. These are subcultures around the world in which people are learn that your reputation, your honor means a lot. And so therefore, if someone harms your reputation or damages your reputation in some way, people learn in those subcultures to respond with aggression. Okay? So that kind of is consistent with this idea that people can learn to be aggressive. And so we talked about that at some length at the end of last class. There are other sort of ideas that are consistent with the idea that aggression can be learned as well. So before in this class, we talked very, very briefly about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And operant conditioning in particular is when it's the idea that if you're rewarded for some behavior, that increases the likelihood that you'll perform that behavior in the future. And conversely, if you're punished for a behavior, that decreases the likelihood that you'll be aggressive or engage in that behavior in the future. And so the same principle applies for aggression. So you can imagine if you've got a little child, for instance, and that kid hits his sister and is able to steal her toy, he's basically been rewarded for behaving aggressively. Therefore, that kid might learn to behave aggressively over time. If, on the other hand, that child is punished by his parents for behaving aggressively, that should decrease the likelihood that he'll behave aggressively in the future. So we can learn to behave aggressively or not, depending on whether we've been rewarded or punished for those behaviors in the past. And just to respond to a question in chat about assignment 3, option B, can you use any movie show? Yes, you can use any movie or show as long as you just give a very, very brief synopsis of the show or the scene that you're talking about. So you give me some context so I know how to evaluate your assignment. But other than that, it's up to you. This is why some people have argued that we shouldn't negotiate with terrorists, of course, because if terrorists use aggression and then they're rewarded for that aggression because they get what they want, that should increase the likelihood that they'll engage in terrorist acts in the future. And these are just basic principles of operant conditioning. And this raises an interesting question, because if you take spanking, for instance, so imagine that you've got parents who spank their child every time their child misbehaves. So let's say that a child behaves aggressively and they then get spanked, okay? On the one hand, they're being punished for behaving aggressively. So according to principles of operant conditioning, being punished for behaving aggressively should lead them to be less likely to behave aggressively in the future. On the other hand, the parent themselves is using aggression to get what they want, okay? So it could potentially teach the child that you can use aggression to get what you want in the world. And so the question is, what is the effect of spanking? Is spanking going to decrease aggressive behavior or increase aggressive behavior? Well, note first of all that this is a causal question, right? So the question is, does spanking cause an increase or decrease in aggression? And as we've seen before in this class, if you have a causal question, what we really need to answer that question is an experiment. But in this case, we can't ethically conduct an experiment because we'd have to randomly assign kids to be spanked or not spanked, and we can't beat kids in our studies, right? So we can't actually conduct experiments on this question for obvious ethical reasons. So what researchers have done is use different types of methodologies to look at the relationship between spanking and becoming aggressive. And this is the results. There we go. These are the results of one such study. So what they did in the study is they brought kids into the lab, and using various measurements, they were able to measure their antisocial behavior, which is basically a measurement, you can imagine as a measurement of how aggressive these kids are, okay? Then what they did is they left the lab and they came back sometime later, maybe it's a year or 2 years or something later, okay? And they again measured their antisocial behavior, again, a measurement of their aggression. And so what's being graphed here is their change in that antisocial behavior score, or change in aggression, meaning anything above 0 means the kid is becoming or has become more aggressive over time. Anything below 0 means the child has become less aggressive over time. And what they can do is they can graph this as a function of how many times per week on average these kids were spanked, okay? So you've got some kids, in other words, down here, who were never spanked. And what this graph shows is that over time, they become somewhat less aggressive. Okay. Now, this is a natural sort of maturation process. So what happens is that children tend to be really, really aggressive at first. Okay. In fact, there are some people who have claimed that the most aggressive people in the world are not terrorists or criminals. They're in fact children. Children can't obviously inflict the types of damage that terrorists can or that criminals can, but children are way more aggressive than terrorists and biker gangs and things like that in terms of the frequency of aggressive acts. But what happens is that over time, children tend to learn that they're not allowed to behave aggressively all the time, right? They're not allowed to hit their brother or sister to steal their toy. So as a consequence, naturally, children tend to get less aggressive over time. However, what these researchers showed here is that if the child was spanked one time per week, or among children who were spanked about once a week, they actually got more aggressive over time. Among kids who were spanked twice a week, they also got more aggressive over time. Among kids who were spanked 3 times a week, they got really more aggressive over time. And the more times that they were spanked, the more aggressive they tended to get over time. Okay. Now, this is not an experiment. So as I said, you can't definitively establish a causal link here. We can't say that being spanked caused those kids to become more aggressive over time because it's not an experiment. But it's certainly consistent with that idea that being spanked, it seems like it might cause children to become more aggressive over time. And so, of course, the question then is why? Why does being spanked cause or potentially cause these children to become more aggressive over time? And the key theoretical idea here, key theory in social psychology to explain this is something known as social learning theory. And this is something you might have come across in another psychology class, like an intro psych class or something, or developmental psych class. So the basic idea here is that, and this theory came around in like the 1970s-ish, somewhere in there, 60s, 70s. And so prior to that time in psychology, a lot of psychologists simply believed that the behaviors we engage in were a function of the patterns of rewards and punishments we received in the past, just like operant conditioning principles that we talked about before. But in the 1970s, a researcher by the name of Albert Bandura came along and said that, yes, although that can certainly happen, we certainly do learn by being punished and rewarded, we can also learn simply by observing other people, even if we're not directly rewarded or punished for that behavior. Okay? This is a type of observational learning, in other words. And his theory in which he described this is called social learning theory. So we can learn behavior, we can learn social behavior by watching others. And children in particular are likely to watch the behavior of their parents, right? So in other words, by observing the behavior of your parents, you can learn to engage in certain behaviors that they engage in. And Carolina, as you were pointing out in the chat, the famous study here is the Bobo doll study, which I want to describe to you briefly. In fact, I'll do more than describe it. I have a video so you can actually see what's going on in this study. The basic idea in this study is that Albert Bandura, the researcher, had a bunch of kids and he randomly assigned them to one of 2 conditions. In one condition, they were shown, I think it was a video of another person, what they call an aggressive model, because they're modeling behavior. Okay, it's a person who's in this room with what's known as a Bobo doll. And a Bobo doll is a big doll. It's almost like life-sized. It's kind of a small person size. And it's a big balloon with weighted feet. So you can punch it and it'll fall down and pop right back up, right? And so half of the kids in the study were randomly assigned to a condition in which these kids were watching this woman punch this Bobo doll and throw it up in the air and sit on it and punch it, as you'll see in a second. The other half of the kids were in a condition in which they did not see this person hitting this Bobo doll. All of the kids then, one at a time, were allowed into this room in which there were a bunch of toys that they can play with, including one of these Bobo dolls. And what the researchers wanted to know is, would the kids who saw this aggressive model engage in aggressive behavior by hitting the Bobo doll, would they as well be more likely to engage in aggressive behavior themselves when they're placed in a room with this Bobo doll? The kids were never rewarded directly for playing with this Bobo doll. And so if the kids are more aggressive after watching this aggressive model, then that would indicate that they've learned to behave aggressively simply by observing another person. And so I want to show you a clip from the study so you can see this in action. hopefully the sound will work. The male voice you're going to hear in the background is going to be that of Albert Bandura, the researcher. This is the aggressive person here, or the person who's modeling the aggressive behavior, and this is the Bobo doll that she's going to be hitting.
Model pummeled the doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied play materials, and children could choose to play aggressively or non-aggressively. The children devised new ways of hitting the doll. Now, the object of interest was the novel aggressive acts, not punching the doll. Children in the control group who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling never exhibited the novel forms of aggression. And here's a creative embellishment. A doll becomes a weapon of assault.
All right. So cute, but so evil, that girl. Just like my ex-girlfriend. Anyway, so you can see there that because the kids were behaving more aggressively in the condition where they had seen that aggressive modeling, and because they were randomly assigned to conditions, et cetera, we can claim that aggression can be caused simply by observing other people. Now, I'll mention one thing that you might have noticed. So last class, I mentioned that according to the operational definition of aggression, aggression only counts if it's directed at a living being, right? And clearly that was not the case in the study. It was directed at a doll or a Bobo doll. Now, the reason for that is because it wasn't until after these studies and other studies that social psychologists realized they needed to have an operational definition. So they didn't necessarily use the same sort of operational definition back then for aggression. But in modern day social psychology research, You wouldn't conduct a study this way because, again, in order to count as aggression, we're interested in instances where people are aggressing against a living being, right? And so they use other methodologies. So for instance, there are some studies measure aggression by having participants in a lab, and the participant is able to decide how much hot sauce they want to make the other participant drink, with the idea being that the more hot sauce they give to the other person, the more aggressive they're being because they want to put them in pain. They have studies where the participant is allowed, or at least they believe they're allowed to blast the other participant who's wearing headphones with a bunch of white noise, and you can set the decibel levels. You can decide how loud you want to make it for them. So the idea being that the louder you make it, the more painful it's going to be. And so there's different methodologies. We've sort of advanced in the methodologies that we use in order to incorporate that aspect of the operational definition. Okay, where's my mouse here? There we go. Okay. So what this means, what social learning theory means, is that we can therefore learn aggression from other people. So as I mentioned, we can learn from our parents in particular. If we see our parents behaving aggressively, so parents who spank their children, for instance, the child just getting spanked can learn that that adult is getting what they want by using aggression. So the child learns that they can use aggression to get what they want later on. And it's partly for that reason that we tend to see that children who are abused as children tend to be more likely to become abusers themselves of their own children when they grow up, which sort of makes sense in the context of social learning theory, because those kids who are beaten or spanked or abused, they learn that adults use violence to get what they want, and therefore they're more likely to use violence on their own children. It also means that we could learn aggressive behavior from other sources as well, whether that's like television or movies or the media, things like that. So a little bit later on this class, we'll talk a little bit about research looking at the effects of violent media on aggression as well. But a lot of that stems from these ideas behind social learning theory. Okay. But aggression is not simply something that's either biological or learned. There's also situational factors that influence aggression. In other words, there's certain things in our environment that make it more likely that we're going to behave aggressively. And so I want to talk about what some of those situational factors are. And the first one is something we've seen before in a different context, which is physiological arousal. So if you recall before, when we talked about attraction, we talked about this concept known as misattribution of arousal, which is the idea that if you're in a heightened physiologically aroused state, so your heart is beating quick and you've got butterflies in your stomach, that sort of feeling, which can be created by like having a couple cups of coffee or by being nervous or excited. If you happen to be in that state and someone comes along and does something which is otherwise ordinarily only maybe slightly annoying, if you're in this heightened physiological state, what often happens is we might misattribute the arousal that was actually created from some other source. And we might interpret that as meaning that we're really angry at this person. And if we're really angry at them, we're more likely to retaliate against them. And so a number of studies have shown this tendency that, for instance, watching a violent movie, which is exciting, tends to increase our physiological arousal, or exercise tends to increase our physiological arousal. And people who have just watched a violent movie or just exercised are more likely to retaliate aggressively against someone than someone who has not just watched a violent movie or exercised, because they're misattributing their arousal to being angry at this person. They think they're angrier at this person than they really are. So just to give you an example of this is a study where researchers randomly assigned participants to either exercise for a few minutes or to not exercise. And that's, of course, just a manipulation of their physiological arousal levels. And then right afterwards, that participant is then angered or not by another person. Okay. That participant is then able to deliver an electric shock, or at least they believe they're able to deliver an electric shock to this other person that just angered them or didn't anger them, one or the other. And they're allowed to set the shock level. Okay, so what I'm going to show you on the y-axis here is the strength of the shock level the participant set to try to shock the other person. So if we first look at people who didn't exercise, okay, so these people are not in a heightened physiological state. What we tend to show is that people set higher shocks if the person just angered them than if they didn't. And that's pretty common, right? Obviously, if someone just angered you and you want to retaliate, you're going to set a higher level shock than if they didn't anger you. That's a pretty standard finding. But what's particularly interesting and what's relevant to us right now is that this effect gets even stronger, gets much stronger among participants who had just exercised. So in other words, with these people, the people who had just exercised, if they encounter someone who angers them, they set really high levels of shock, right? And part of the reason, or I guess the main reason for why that is because they're in this heightened physiological aroused state when this person angers them. They think they're angrier at the person than they really are because they're thinking, oh my God, my heart's beating quickly. There's butterflies in my stomach. I'm feeling kind of jittery. That's a sign of anger. And so they are really likely to retaliate against that person. Okay? So the fact that this gray bar is so high here is an indication that that misattribution of arousal is happening, that they've misattributed their arousal from exercise to being angry, and thus they retaliate against that person. In fact, we can also use this concept of misattribution of arousal to explain the relationship between aggression and heat. And so we know from a number of sources that there is this link between aggression and heat. So I'll give you a couple examples of this, but one is that there are more violent crimes that are committed in the summer than in any other month. Obviously, it's hotter in the summer than in other seasons, and so that would be consistent with the idea that there's a link between temperature and aggression. So here's some data, for instance, looking at a number of different violent crimes, so rapes, assaults, uprisings, as a function of the season, and you can see that they tend to peak in the summer months. This by itself obviously doesn't conclude that temperature is what's responsible for this effect, but it's certainly consistent with the idea that as temperature rises, aggression rises as well. And yeah, you're right in the chat that I mentioned this at the beginning of the semester when we were looking at correlations. And I mentioned that there's a correlation between cities that sell more ice cream and cities that have higher crime rates. And largely the reason for that is because cities that are hotter sell more ice cream, and cities that are hotter tend to produce higher rates of crime as well. This is a study that I think is kind of interesting that looked at baseball games. And what they did is they looked at the likelihood that a pitcher would hit a batter with a pitch. This is the likelihood that they would hit a batter with a pitch as a function of the temperature outside. And you can see that games that are played when it's hotter, there is a greater likelihood that the pitcher would hit the batter with a pitch. And so the idea is that when it's hotter outside, the pitchers get angrier, and that anger translates into them aiming for the batter more. There's all sorts of other evidence for this idea as well. So for instance, we saw that Southerners, well, with one caveat, Southerners are more violent than Northerners. I should have a caveat here. That's only true following provocation, okay? Following damage to reputation or something. And Southerners tend to react with more violence than Northerners. Under normal situations, if they're not provoked, Southerners are not more violent than Northerners. And then if you look within the same city, cities or summers that are hotter within the same city tend to have higher crime for that year than when it's cooler, when they have cooler summers. So hotter summers are associated with more crime than cooler summers. And obviously we can run experiments on this as well. So there have been studies where participants have been randomly assigned to be in either a hot room or a cool room and are provoked by someone. And then you can measure some sort of aggressive response. And people who are in hot rooms tend to respond with more aggression than people who are in cool rooms. And so this is all leading up to this idea that temperature increases arousal. And the reason it does so is because of the same concept of misattribution of arousal. The idea is this, is that heat tends to increase our physiological arousal levels. So it produces the same set of physiological responses as we've seen before by exercise and things like that. But what happens, or what people tend to believe, is that heat lowers arousal. Okay, because if you think of a really hot day, you're thinking about just kind of laying out and doing nothing for a while, right? So people think heat lowers arousal. So what that means is that when people experience these heightened arousal feelings that were actually created by heat, they don't attribute it to heat because they think heat lowers arousal. So they start looking for some other reason why their physiological arousal levels are heightened. And so therefore, if someone comes along and does something that is normally just kind of somewhat annoying, you now may think you're angrier at this person than you really are because you're attributing your increased arousal levels to anger. And therefore, you're likely to retaliate against this person. So the arousal that's actually caused by heat can be misattributed to anger, leading to retaliation in the form of violence or aggression. Okay. So that's how heat, or that's the reason why heat is related to aggression, is through this misattribution of arousal phenomenon. Another situational factor that can increase aggression is alcohol. In other words, there's an association between aggression and having drank alcohol. People who drink alcohol tend to be more aggressive than people who don't. And there are a number of reasons why this is the case. And of course, this isn't the case for everybody. Not everybody gets more aggressive with alcohol, but some people do. And there's a few reasons why this is the case. So one reason is that alcohol tends to weaken people's inhibitions. What that means is that alcohol isn't necessarily leading people to become aggressive where they wouldn't have become aggressive before, but rather what happens is that when we're sober, when we're not drinking, we are able to sort of inhibit our natural aggressive tendencies. So we know that, if you're angry at someone, you can't just simply hit them whenever you want. We've learned that to function in society, you can't just be aggressive against people, right? So we can inhibit our own behavior, in other words. But when you're drinking, that inhibitory mechanism is weakened. We're less able to inhibit ourselves, in other words. And therefore, our true feelings are more likely to come out. And so if your true feelings are already aggressive and you're less able to inhibit them, therefore you're going to behave more aggressively under the influence of alcohol. Okay, so that's one reason alcohol can increase aggression. There's a couple other reasons as well. Another effect that alcohol has is it tends to narrow our focus, right? So when you're sober, you can think about multiple different things at once potentially. But when you've been drinking, you can only sort of focus on one thing at a time, right? And you can't think about other things at once. You don't have the same cognitive resources available to you if you've been drinking. And this is kind of key because under normal circumstances, our cognitive functioning might allow us to diffuse aggression. Here's what I mean by that. Let's say that you're walking down the street and someone bumps into you. And our natural tendency, of course, is to engage in the fundamental attribution error and to blame their behavior on their personality, right? They did it on purpose. And although we tend to do that, we have an ability, if we really want to override that natural impulse, right? We can choose to say, okay, you know what? I think they might have tripped into me. It wasn't on purpose. You can think through that, and that will reduce your aggressive urge. But if you've been drinking and you don't have those same cognitive resources available to you, you're no longer able to think about that, right? You notice that someone bumps into you, but you don't have the ability to think about how that person might have tripped. You can't override your natural aggressive impulse so much. And so as a consequence, if you can't override that aggressive impulse because you don't have the cognitive resources available to do so, you're more likely to attribute their behavior to their personality, and therefore you're going to retaliate against them. So basically, by narrowing your focus and leading you not to be able to use your cognitive functioning, alcohol can lead to aggression that way as well. And a third way that alcohol can increase aggression is simply through placebo effects. So this is the idea that if people believe that alcohol increases aggression and they believe that they've consumed alcohol, people will tend to behave consistently with those beliefs, with those expectations. And you can conduct some studies where you can trick people into thinking they're drinking alcohol, and people will start to behave a little bit drunk. Okay? Obviously, they're not actually drunk because they actually haven't had alcohol. But if they believe they're drinking alcohol, they tend to act in ways that are consistent with how they think a drunk person acts. And so if people believe that alcohol causes aggression, then drinking alcohol can lead them to start acting in ways that they believe people act when they've been drinking. Okay, so for all these reasons, alcohol can increase aggression. Maybe one of the most important factors, at least historically, as a factor that can influence aggression is frustration. In fact, it was once thought, and we're going back to like the 1920s here, it was once thought that frustration was really the only cause of aggression. In fact, this is something that was proposed in what's known as the frustration aggression hypothesis. Okay, The frustration aggression hypothesis says two related things. First off, that when people are frustrated, that frustration will always lead to the motivation to aggress. Now, they define frustration here in terms of if you have a goal you're trying to achieve and someone blocks your ability to achieve that goal. That's what frustration means. So for instance, let's say that you're at work and you're up for a promotion, but your boss decides not to give you the promotion and to give it to someone else, okay? Your boss has frustrated you in the sense that he's blocked your ability to achieve your goal. And according to the frustration aggression hypothesis, what happens is that frustration will lead people to develop this motivation to aggress. They're not necessarily going to aggress against the person who frustrated them, because we know in society you can't just hit your boss, right? But it leads to this motivation to aggress. So the first claim they made was frustration always leads to that aggression motivation. And the second claim is the flip of that, that if you see an instance of aggression, it's always the result of frustration. So in other words, frustration and aggression are always inextricably linked. They're always tied together. That's the claim. And based on some of the ideas they came up with, they proposed some other concepts as well. So for instance, let's take this first claim here, that frustration always leads to the motivation to aggress. Well, what these researchers believed, this again, back about 100 years ago, is that if frustration builds up this motivation to aggress, you've got to release that somehow. And we can't always release it against the source of our frustration. So you can't always hit your boss if your boss didn't give you that promotion, as I mentioned. So what we do is we engage in what's known as displacement. Displacement means that we aggress against a substitute target. So not against the person who frustrated us, but something else. So maybe the person who doesn't get the promotion goes home and yells at his kids, for instance. So he's taking out his frustration against a different target, right? That's known as displacement. And as a consequence of displacement, as a consequence of taking out your aggression against someone else, that results in what's called catharsis. Catharsis is a reduction in the aggressive urge resulting from displacement. So in other words, your boss doesn't give you the promotion, that builds up this motivation to aggress. You take it out on your kids, that releases that motivation to aggress, that reduces that aggressive urge. That's catharsis. Okay? So the idea that these researchers had at the time was that aggression is something that builds up inside of you, and you've got to release it every now and then against some sort of target to reduce that aggressive urge. And we even have phrases in the language that are consistent with this idea. So the idea that we need to vent our anger, for instance, is based on this catharsis idea, that we've got to release that anger that builds up inside of us. But this is an old theory, right? This theory is from like 100 years ago, roughly. We've learned a lot since then. And so we can check on the status of the frustration aggression hypothesis as we know it today. Well, it turns out that it's certainly the case that frustration can lead to aggression. And it's certainly the case that aggression is often the result of frustration. But the frustration aggression researchers overstated their case, because we now know that frustration does not always lead to aggression. It can, but it doesn't always. So for instance, maybe you didn't get that promotion because your boss gave it to someone else. But if you also believe that the other person deserved it more than you, then you don't feel angry at not having gotten it. It was a fair promotion, right? It was fair that you didn't get it. And so under that case, you're still frustrated in that you didn't get the promotion, but you don't feel this motivation to aggress. Okay? So frustration does not always lead to aggression. Secondly, aggression can come from other things as well, other than frustration. It doesn't always come from frustration, as the researchers had originally claimed. We've seen just a few minutes ago what some of those sources are, right? It can come from a feeling of being physiologically aroused and misattributing that arousal to anger, for instance, or from alcohol or whatever. Okay, so the researchers kind of overstated their case a little bit. Maybe more importantly, though, is that we now know that the idea of catharsis doesn't really seem to hold. Okay, catharsis doesn't really work. This is a very common belief that it does work. Okay, there's a very common belief in this society that if you're angry, that anger is going to build up inside of you and you've got to release it. And so people might recommend that if you're angry, to hit a pillow or something like that, or scream or something. And the idea there is that that will reduce the aggressive urge. However, there have been a number of studies that show that, in fact, What actually happens is the exact opposite of catharsis. That if you take, let's say you take two groups of people, okay, one group, and you anger both of them. So everybody's got this motivation to aggress. And one group of people, you allow them to punch a punching bag for, let's say, 10 minutes. And the other group of people are not allowed to do anything. They just have to sit in a room for 10 minutes. Okay. If the catharsis hypothesis is correct, then the people who are allowed to punch a punching bag, they should show lower levels of aggression later on. So what happens in these studies is that both groups of people are allowed to aggress against the person that initially angered them. And what they showed is that contrary to the catharsis hypothesis, contrary to that, the people who spent 10 minutes hitting a punching bag, instead of showing less aggression, they show more aggression to the person that angered them. What that means is that the very common sense notions that we have, that anger builds up inside of you and we should punch a pillow or scream whenever you're angry, is the exact opposite of what we should be doing. So let's look at this a little bit. So why is that a case? Why doesn't catharsis work? It seems like it would make sense, right? That you would release your aggression against something like a pillow and you'd feel better. So let's look at why catharsis doesn't work. There's three main reasons. First off, so some people have claimed, for instance, that one way to engage in catharsis, so if you're angry, is to simply watch aggression. So watch aggressive movies or TV shows. It's kind of like vicariously involving yourself with aggression. Some people have claimed that. But we know that watching aggressive media can teach people how to aggress. So we saw that with social learning theory, for instance, that if you watch aggressive behavior, that can lead to an increase in aggressive behavior because we learn behaviors by watching others. But let's go back to the original catharsis claim. Why is it that yourself, you hitting a pillow or a punching bag, why does that not result in a decrease in aggression? Well, one reason is because participating in aggression, if you're hitting a punching bag, you're engaging in exercise, which we know increases your physiological arousal levels. And as we saw when we looked at misattribution of arousal, if you have heightened physiological arousal levels, that actually makes you more likely to aggress later on, right? So as a side effect of punching a punching bag, misattribution of arousal can occur and increase aggression. And thirdly, we have seen through the principle of operant conditioning that if you're rewarded for a behavior, that increases the likelihood that you'll perform it, right? Well, if you're angry and you punch a pillow or a punching bag, it feels good at a subjective level. So effectively, you're being rewarded for engaging in that aggression, for hitting that pillow. And so if being rewarded for a behavior increases your likelihood of performing that behavior in the future, then the fact that it feels good to hit something when we're angry means that makes it more likely for us to hit something when we're angry in the future. Okay. So catharsis does not decrease aggression, it increases aggression, if anything. And this is important because so many people have the wrong idea that what they should do when they're angry is to hit a pillow and try to drain that aggression. That's not how aggression works. So here's how aggression actually works. When you're angry and that aggression, that motivation to aggress builds up inside of us, you don't have to let it out because naturally over time, that aggression will naturally dissipate on its own. Okay? By hitting a punching bag, we're maintaining that aggression longer within us. If you want to get rid of that aggression, then what you want to do is distract yourself as much as possible from the reason why you're angry. The more you distract yourself, the quicker that aggression tends to dissipate. And that is the exact opposite of what every one of us does, right? If someone does something that annoys you, that angers you, what's the first thing you do? You text your friends, you call them, you talk about how horrible it is that this person did this thing to you, right? All you're doing by doing that is maintaining that aggression longer and longer and longer. If, on the other hand, you immediately distracted yourself and you thought about something else, and you did something else, that will make that aggression go away a lot quicker. So that's the best thing that you can do, is to distract yourself, not to hit a punching bag or ruminate on the thing that made you angry in the first place. Okay, so I do want to talk a little bit about studies that have looked at the effect of violent media on aggression, especially given that we've looked at social learning theory, which predicts that watching aggressive TV or movies should tend to lead to an increase in aggression. And there have been hundreds of studies that have been conducted on this topic. And there's all sorts of different types of studies. There have been correlational studies and longitudinal studies and experimental studies. I'm certainly not going to go into all the studies that have been done. I'll just give you sort of a basic overview here. So I'll give you an example of each one of these types of studies. So let's start with correlational studies. These studies are really easy to conduct. You just take a group of people. For each person, you measure how much violent TV they watch, and you measure how aggressive they are, and you just see if there's a correlation between the two. And what these studies show is that there is a correlation, a positive correlation, meaning that on average, the more violent TV someone watches, the more aggressive they tend to be. Okay? Obviously, it's not a perfect correlation. There are people who watch all sorts of aggressive movies and aren't aggressive at all, and there's people who are very aggressive who don't watch aggressive movies. It's not a perfect correlation, but certainly there is a correlation. Now, we know that we can't simply establish causation from a correlation, right? So although this might be tempting to conclude that watching violent TV causes more aggression, that's only one possible explanation. It can also be that that people who are already aggressive tend to like to watch violent TV, or there could be third variables. We saw when we looked at correlations in this semester, there's always at least 3 possible explanations for any given correlation, right? So we can't establish causation here, but there is a correlational link between these two things. In your notes, you have this stuff here. I'm going to skip over this. This gets a little bit too into the weeds with some statistical issues that you don't really need to know about, and it gets a little bit confusing. I'm not going to ask any questions on the exam about this, so don't worry about this accounting for other variables thing. I'm just going to skip over that. Just know that there is a correlation between watching violent TV and behaving aggressively. Okay. Other researchers have used longitudinal studies to look at this. So a longitudinal study is kind of like a correlational study across time, okay? So for instance, what you can do is bring a bunch of people into a lab, and for each person, you measure how aggressive they are and how much violent TV they watch, just like you would in a correlational study. Then what you can do is bring those people back into your lab at a later point in time. It could be a year later, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later. And you measure the same things. You again measure how aggressive they are and how much violent TV they watch. And therefore, you can see how their aggressiveness has changed over time and how much violent TV they watched have changed over time as well. When they conduct these studies, what some researchers have shown is that if you take a bunch of kids and you divide them up into how much violent TV they watch as a kid, as a child, you can use that to predict how violent or aggressive they're going to be later on in life as an adult. And there's a relationship here. So for instance, this is a study that looked at a bunch of kids and they divided them into 3 categories, again, in terms of how much violent TV they watched. So they either watched a low amount, a medium amount, or a high amount. This is at age 8. Okay. They followed up with these kids over the course of the next 22 years. And so at the age of 30, for each of the kids that were in the study, they can measure how violent they had become. And they used as a proxy for this, the seriousness of their criminal acts by age 30. And what you can see here is that among the kids who watched a lot of violent TV at age 8, they committed the most serious criminal acts 22 years later at age 30, right? So you can actually predict how aggressive someone becomes in adulthood by knowing how much violent TV they watched as a child. Okay, as I said, they followed up with these kids over 22 years, so they also followed up with them at different ages, so at age 19 and at age 30. That's why this number is a little bit different than in the prior slide, but it's the same group of kids. So what this means is that viewing violence at age 8 predicted how aggressive they would be at age 19 and at age 30, right? But importantly, if what you know is just how aggressive these kids already are at age 8, that did not predict how much violence they would watch later on in life at age 19 or 30. Another way of saying this is that if you're interested in looking at how aggressive someone is and how much violent TV they watch, viewing violence tends to come before they develop aggressiveness, not the other way around. So in other words, again, this is not an experiment, so we can't establish causation from the study alone, but what this suggests is that viewing violence comes before behaving violently, which is consistent with the causal link that watching violence might cause these kids to behave aggressively. But of course, in order to establish a causal connection, you have to run an experiment. And there have been many experiments done looking at this topic. These are relatively easy to do, although there are some nuances. But generally you can randomly assign people to either watch some violent TV shows or violent movies or something or not. You randomly assign them to condition, then you place them in a situation where they're able to engage in aggressive behavior. And you can do this in a number of different contexts. You can do this in a lab and at home and on the playground at school and all sorts of other contexts. And what studies have shown is that across all sorts of contexts, kids who are randomly assigned to watch violent TV tend to behave more aggressively than kids who did not watch violent TV. Okay? Now, as long as these are properly done experiments, meaning they used random assignment and they controlled for confounds and things like that, then we can now establish a causal connection. We can now say that watching violent TV causes people to behave aggressively. So for instance, this is the result of a study where they randomly assigned people to either watch a violent TV show or not a non-violent TV show. And then they were placed in a situation where they can behave aggressively. And so this is basically a measure of how aggressive they behaved. And they separated the data by boys and girls. And as you can see, both boys and girls were affected by having watched the violent TV show. If they watch violent TV shows, their aggressiveness went up. It had a greater effect on boys. As you can see, the slope is steeper here. But it affected both boys and girls. They both became more aggressive after watching violent TV. Okay, so we have all of our different types of studies, whether it's correlational or longitudinal or experimental. They all tend to converge on the same findings. They all tend to converge on this idea that watching violent TV seems to increase aggression. And so, of course, the question is, why is that the case? And there are a number of explanations for this. And by the way, I do want to say that when we say that watching violent TV can cause aggression, that does not mean that it causes people to, murder 50 people or engage in school shootings or anything like that. That's way, way, way too simplistic a claim to make. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the nuance of this in a second. We're only saying that at some level, it can increase people's tendency to behave aggressively, at least temporarily. Okay, so one reason why violent TV can increase aggression is because watching violent TV can weaken our normal inhibitions against violent behavior. Okay? In other words, if the hero of a movie, let's say, is using aggression to get what they want and they're the good guys, then that sort of legitimizes violence. In other words, we might have this natural tendency to think that violence is bad, but if you're constantly being exposed to movies where the good guys are using violence and aggression to get what they want, it sort of makes it seem okay to do that, right? It legitimizes the violent behavior by weakening your inhibitions. So that's one way that violent TV can increase aggression. It's not the only way. As we've seen before with misattribution of arousal, we know that watching violent TV or violent movies is exciting. That's why people watch them a lot of the time, right? When it's exciting, what that means is it increases our physiological arousal levels. And as a consequence, if you leave a movie and you have these heightened physiological arousal levels and someone comes along and does something that's kind of annoying, you now may think that you're really angry at this person because of these heightened physiological arousal levels, and you're more likely to retaliate against them. Okay, so this obviously only happens in the short term because those heightened physiological arousal levels created by that violent movie only last so long, but at least in the short term, that can increase aggression. Furthermore, violent TV can increase aggression through a process of imitation. In other words, if you have someone who watches someone behave violently, that can lead people to imitate it. We saw this in a sense with social learning theory, like the kids who watched the violent model hitting the bobo doll themselves imitated that behavior and would hit the bobo doll. And it can give people ideas about aggression. So if you looked at one of the original school shootings, Columbine, there's unfortunately way too many school shootings now, but if you look at one of the first ones in 1999, in the year or so after that Columbine shooting, which was all over the news at the time, there was like this sort of rash of school shootings that happened for that year. And part of the reason for that is because people who might have had these sort of homicidal tendencies saw the school shooting on the news and it gave them ideas and they tried to imitate it. And I think of this in terms of like little kids. I've sometimes seen like if they're watching wrestling or something, and a little kid watching wrestling wants to try out the move he just saw on his little sister, so he pile drives his sister or something. That's an example of imitation as well. Okay, and the explanation that I think we hear about the most maybe is that violent TV can increase aggression through a process of desensitization. And what that means is that at some level, we have a natural abhorrence towards violence, most people, that it makes us feel bad to watch violence occur. Right? But if you are constantly being exposed to violence through violent movies or violent TV, our bodies habituate to that. And we don't show the same sort of biological reaction to violence as we originally showed. So in other words, after seeing a lot of violence, it no longer produces those negative feelings on us. We're more tolerant, in other words, of violence because we've become desensitized to it. You can see this just by looking at the past, let's say 50 years of movies. What was considered a violent movie in 1970 or 1980 doesn't necessarily look so violent today. And the reason for that is because violence in the 1970s, people start to get used to it. It doesn't arouse them. They're desensitized to it. And so Hollywood ramps up the aggression to try to get that reaction out of viewers, right? So they become more aggressive. And then the viewers start to sensitize themselves to that heightened level of violence. So Hollywood ups the violence levels again. And so constantly there's sort of this upping of violence and aggression in TV and movies because people get desensitized to it. So just to give you an example, there's a study that looked at desensitization among people who had just watched The Karate Kid or not. If you've ever seen The Karate Kid, it's nowhere close to anywhere as violent as a lot of movies are today. It's literally someone who's engaging in karate. But in the study, people were randomly assigned to either watch a clip from The Karate Kid or not. And after that clip was over, the researchers staged a fight right outside the room so the participants could overhear these two people get into a fight. Now, what the researchers really wanted to know is how long would it take these participants to go try to break up that fight? And what they noted, which is consistent with what they had hypothesized, is that if these participants had just watched a clip from The Karate Kid, it took them longer to go break up that fight compared to if they had not watched that clip. Because the idea being that watching that violence, watching the karate in that clip, desensitized them to the actual fight that was going on outside, and therefore they didn't think it was as much of an emergency, so they took longer to go break it up. There have been a lot of criticisms of this sort of research over the years, and partly because it's a highly political issue in a sense, and because Hollywood and video game companies and things like that have a lot of money that they spend in terms of PR and like attacking this sort of research because they want to undermine it. And so some of the criticisms have been okay, and some of them have been pretty bad of this research. So I want to go over what some of the criticisms are, and then what some of the responses are that the researchers give to those criticisms. So one criticism is the following, that when we study aggression in the lab, obviously we can't look at things like murders. We're only looking at small instances of aggression. And we don't really look at aggression over decades. We've got people in the lab for an hour, right? So some people say that the effects that we're looking at in this research are very small and short-lived. They don't last long. And that is true as a criticism of experiments, because in experiments, we can't keep people in our lab for years, obviously. We can't measure murder and things like that for ethical reasons, which is why a lot of researchers also use correlational research and longitudinal research, so they can study the relationship between violent media and aggression for long periods of time. And so we talked about studies where people followed up kids over 22 years, and they looked at how serious their criminal acts were. So there is research that has looked at larger effects and over longer periods of time. Secondly, well, criticism is that in these studies, in experimental studies, usually participants are shown clips from movies. They're not shown a whole 2-hour-long movie. They're shown like a 5-minute clip, because it's hard to keep people in the lab for that long. And so the criticism is that, well, what's happening is you're showing people this violent clip out of context. And if they had seen the whole movie or the whole TV show, that would create a context in which you can place that specific violent clip. And so maybe the person in these movies, for instance, gets punished later on in the movie for using that violence, and you're not showing people that punishment in the lab, right? Which could be true, although I think it's pretty easily countered that in actual movies and TV shows, a lot of the heroes who use violence are never punished for that violence. There is no context that minimizes that violence later on in the movie. So that context just may not exist. A very common one is that, well, you know, I watched violent TV as a kid and I'm not murdering people right now. So therefore your whole idea is nonsense, right? Lots of people watch violent TV and don't commit violent crimes. And that's of course true. Most people who watch violent TV don't commit violent crimes, right? But again, what we're describing in research are tendencies. So on average, people are more likely to be violent if they've watched violent TV than not. But it doesn't mean that every single person is affected by violent TV. Many people are not affected by violent TV, right? So we're just talking about averages and tendencies, not that this is going to affect every single person equally. When I was a grad student at Iowa State University, one of the psychologists there did aggression research. And so he published a bunch of research showing that, for instance, playing violent video games tends to increase aggression as well. And he got a lot of hate mail from kids whose parents didn't allow them to play violent video games because of his research. And one of the kids wrote him a letter saying something like, playing violent video games has not made me aggressive. And if you say otherwise, I'll kill you. Not realizing the irony of what he was saying right there. Does genetics have to do with whether it affects you? That's a question in the chat. Yeah, probably. I'm not an expert in this field, but I would imagine that there are some people who are predisposed more than others. There's also people who have learned, like if people who have had parenting where they've learned not to behave aggressive, they're probably less affected by violent TV and movies as well. There's probably a whole bunch of factors that determines whether violent TV leads people to behave aggressively. Well, in our experimental studies, those studies are sort of artificial, the criticism goes, right? And we're bringing people into a lab, we're showing them a clip, 5-minute clip from a movie, we're placing them in a situation where maybe they are delivering like noise blasts into someone else's headphones, as I mentioned before, or determining how much hot sauce to drink. It's all artificial, right? That doesn't happen in the real world. That's the criticism. And that is certainly true. That's not specific, of course, to aggression research. We talked at the beginning of the semester how a lot of experimental research has the same criticism, which is that it's sort of artificial, the scenarios we put people in our labs, right? So it doesn't really generalize to the real world. And it has to sort of be that way because in order to get the experimental control required of an experiment, you have to have a lot of control over that study, which is very true. And this is why researchers also conduct correlational studies and longitudinal studies, and they look at these effects in the real world to make sure that the effects that they see in the lab generalize to the real world as well. But then the critique goes, well, but those studies, longitudinal and correlational studies, don't prove causality because they're not experiments, which is also true. That's one of the problems with correlational and longitudinal studies. Again, as we saw at the beginning of the semester, which is why we have experimental studies as well. So the key here is that, especially in aggression research, but in all sorts of areas of social psychology, we don't believe things are true just because we have one specific type of research that's shown an effect. What we try to do is test these effects in experimental studies in the lab and also in the real world in correlational and longitudinal studies. And if all of those studies' findings converge on the same ideas, that's what gives us a lot of faith that these ideas, these concepts are true, right? So if you look at any one study, that one study is going to have potential problems, right? That's why we always base our conclusions on a whole body of research, not just on single studies. All right, well, what about pornography? So we've looked at how aggressive movies and TV shows can affect aggression. What about pornography? Can that increase aggression, especially if it's aggression towards women? And there have been some studies on this. One of the main studies randomly assigned people to watch either 0, 18, or 36 pornographic movies, which is an awful lot of porn if you ask me, but no one did. So what these studies showed, though, is that it's really important to distinguish between two types of pornography when you're looking at their effects on aggression. So you can look at, for instance, non-violent pornography, where there is no violence portrayed against women, for instance. And so what these researchers have showed is that among men who watched non-violent pornography, when they're placed in a situation where they can aggress against another male in particular, they showed lower levels of aggressiveness than people who didn't watch any nonviolent pornography. This is probably because nonviolent pornography can tend to produce low levels of pleasant arousal. And when we're feeling sort of mildly pleasant, that's sort of incompatible with behaving aggressively towards other people. So that's sort of the good news, is that it can lower aggression. On the other hand, it also led to sort of a negative attitude change. So in particular, what the researchers did is they told participants about a trial where a man was had been accused of rape, or not accused, but had been convicted of rape. And they had to decide on sentencing for this convicted rapist. And the participants who had watched a lot of nonviolent pornography recommended more lenient sentences for the rapist than people who had not watched pornography. So it led them to become more accepting, or at least less punitive towards rapists. So kind of a mixed bag there. If you look, though, at violent pornography, those effects tend to be pretty negative overall. So violent pornography, in particular, where violence is being portrayed against women in particular, this did lead to an increase in aggressiveness. And particularly, it led to an increase in male to female aggressiveness. So if in the violent pornography, men were shown being violent against women, that did increase men's tendencies to behave violently towards women among these participants as well. So it had that negative behavioral change. It also led to a negative attitude change. So men who had watched violent pornography were more likely to accept violence against women, meaning if when the researchers gave them questionnaires and asked people whether they believed with various statements, men who had just watched violent pornography were more likely to agree with statements such as women have an unconscious desire to be raped, for instance. Men were more likely to agree with that if they just watched violent pornography, which is problematic. They also showed that men exhibited a greater acceptance of certain rape myths. So rape myths would be something like, if a woman makes out with a man, it's her fault if he rapes her. Okay. So men who had just watched violent pornography were more likely to agree with that statement than men who had not watched violent pornography. So viewing violence against women in particular had particularly negative effects, both in terms of behaviors and attitudes that men had towards women. Okay, I'm going to leave things here. So remember, we only have 2 classes left. So I'll finish talking about aggression next class, and then we'll talk about helping, and we'll go into the final class of helping. Remember that we have 2 quizzes left in this class, and there's only 2 classes left. So I'm going to give a quiz on Tuesday and Thursday of next week, so make sure you note that. Remember, stop sharing. Remember that you have assignment 3, which is due 1 week from today. And remember that you have also that additional extra credit opportunity that everyone can get 2 points in the class for, which is in Canvas right now in the modules section. You should see that. So make sure you get that done as well over the next few days. Okay, have a great weekend, guys, and I will see you next week.